Thank you, David. I'll just extract a couple of items from the report, if that's okay. I'm conscious also that actually, as described in the report, we have a relatively new method of contacting the public in terms of the board, which is ask the board questions. And David has a few questions to answer, as it were, which encroach on a couple of the subjects in my report. So I won't steal David's thunder in that regard. But the items that aren't relevant, as it were, to the Ask the Board questions are, firstly, as you'll see within the report, the COVID update is again a positive one. I'm really pleased with how the teams continue to manage and support both our staff and our service users. So the COVID management arrangements remain strong and in place. Risk assessments have been a real priority. Risk assessments for our staff, that is, have been a real priority over the last month. Emerging evidence on a relatively regular basis nationally enables us to evolve those risk assessments at a local level, which I'm pleased with, because it increases our ability to manage and control risk for our staff. What I'd also mention in terms of planning and management of operations is that you'll be perhaps pleased to know that the flu immunisation programme planning is now in place. Even though we are in July, things can move quickly. So I'm pleased that we're preempting winter risks in that regard. And also more broadly, winter planning is now actively happening for this coming winter. And Jonathan O'Brien in particular is heavily involved in that and coordinating key aspects of that winter planning actually across the system. So thank you to John and operational colleagues for all of that work. And of course, Kenny's team for the work that we're going to be undertaking on the immunisation work. Next, a couple of items around restoration and recovery. So internally, you'll see the report goes into quite a lot of detail about the work that we're doing. We're continuing to operate through two lenses, two focuses, one corporately and the second one clinically, operationally. Both are progressing well and are being managed through our programme management office. Critical to the short to medium term management of our restoration and recovery. And because of the fact that we haven't stood down many services, we are quite different to the acute in that regard, is our support for our staff. And what we've put in place are personal plans for members of staff, particularly corporate staff, that go to the heart of what the requirements are for each and every one of us around whether it be agile working, office working in a safe way. So I'm really pleased that as an organisation we've approached restoration and recovery and evaluation of how we operate going forward in such a personalised way. I know that every organisation, nationally hasn't approached, NHS organisation hasn't approached it in that way. So I'm really pleased that we've applied that very personal touch to that restoration and recovery work, particularly in relation to our teams. There is in parallel a piece of work that is looking at longer term transformational aspects of our restoration and recovery. So essentially in parallel to the personal plans and the short-term management of COVID and staff safety and well-being, we've got transformational work ongoing, which is the big ticket stuff around estates, the wider digital conversation that we've just had, which again will come to fruition and evolve through this year. So my expectation is in this calendar year we will have formulated a set of plans that will very clearly describe the future direction of travel through 2021 and beyond for the organisation in terms of the logistics of how we work, how we support our staff, and of course in particular our service users. Just remaining briefly on restoration and recovery, the system, as you won't be surprised, is also well on with restoration and recovery work. Some bigger challenges out there to an extent than we have. So restoration of services such as cancer, etc., are well underway. But of course, a number of services external to ourselves were stood down back in March, so are required to be brought back in. So work is ongoing to achieve that. And on top of that, what I would call core restoration and recovery, that the basic bringing back of services as a system, and particularly the ICPs, are developing what I would call more transformational programs of work. I've talked to non-executives about this recently. Those for me are absolutely critical, because those are the pieces of work that will excite colleagues out there and internally, get them to want to really come together and build transformational programs of work. And of course, the expectation is that they will massively impact positively on how we provide healthcare across North Staffordshire. So I'm really pleased that we've pulled together a set of work programmes in the Northern ICP in particular that I think will create that glue across the system to be able to enable us to operate better together, which of course includes general practice. And I'm not just saying that because Keith is on the line. We've over a period of time reflected on the importance of general practice primary care network involvement in that work, and we're ensuring through colleagues in general practice that we include GPs in all aspects of those ICP programs. And perhaps the last thing I would mention is the final item, which is around our continual evolution of how we engage with the public in particular out there. But it's actually the first item that I want to mention, which is our executive drop-ins, our virtual exec drop-ins. So they are digitally based. They started off as being face-to-face, but understandably have become digitally based of late. Since we reintroduced them only probably about a month ago, I would estimate that we've done at least a couple of dozen drop-in sessions with probably 100 plus staff on those sessions, and they're interactive conversations. So the staff have equal opportunity to ask the executive that's the exec lead for that conversation questions, equally as the executive lead is able to come back to the team. So I think it's a fantastic way to pull together large amounts of intelligence, understanding on how things are going out there, how staff are feeling, how staff are technically working and operating in this very different environment. And we use that information, pull it together and have conversations about what next through our senior leadership team. So for me, it's a fantastic source of knowledge and information to get to the heart of how our teams operationally are managing at this point in time. I think I'll leave it there if that's okay, but of course happy as always to answer any questions that people have.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'll ask for that. The obvious follow on from your last point is that's great to hear about the drop-in sessions, but as a NED myself, we're kind of missing out on our drop-in sessions, and we need to try and bring those back into play in one way or another and not wait for normality to resume. So perhaps we can bear that in mind and see what we can do. Yeah. So anybody else on Peter's report? That's quite remarkable.
Can I just have one very quick question, please, David?
Yes, of course.
Just very quickly. In terms of looking ahead and planning, and planning in August now, where are we on Brexit planning? Or have we got the same degree of preparedness that we had last time in anticipation of a no deal?
Now there we are, Brexit. Hey, I knew it'd come back at some point. So yeah, I suppose what I would say on that is obviously the focus has been on other things of late, but the work that we'd completed up to the point of COVID was, in my opinion, robust. I think we kept the board well updated on progress, and that progress hasn't changed. I suppose we still have in the background all of the contingency plans. We are less affected, as I mentioned to the board a while ago, we're less affected by Brexit than many, if not most, NHS trusts, given the number of EU staff that we have, research and development levels, although I would like the latter to be a lot higher because we don't have huge amounts of research and development work, particularly linked to the EU and EU funding, we're not heavily impacted. And of course, there are other things like supplies of medicines, etc., from the EU. So the stuff that is in our control, I believe we still have well in hand. And of course, there is stuff that is not within our control that we can try and mitigate as best we can, but is to a large extent in the hands of others, NHS supply chain, etc. But I'm pleased with where we're at. I was pleased with where we're at when we sort of put our eye onto other things. I think Jonathan may have his hand up, or he had got his hand up briefly before I started to answer. I don't know if Jonathan wants to add.
Yeah, Jonathan.
You've answered the question perfectly, Peter, from a emergency preparedness point of view, and I've just put a little note in the comments. We're as prepared as we were. The plans are still on the shelf, ready to go. We're not being asked about it by regulators at the moment, and all I'd say is if anything was going to test our resilience and emergency response in terms of preparedness, you couldn't have asked for a better year to prepare us, to be quite honest. I think in many respects, Brexit, from an operational point of view, will be much easier than COVID, from our own organisation point of view.
I mean, a quick one from me, Phil. I mean, are we affected on drugs at all by a no-deal Brexit?
All our drugs, Phil, are sourced through the supplies through UH&M, through our suppliers, I believe. And no, we were very specifically in the last lead up to exit date told not to stockpile drugs. There were drugs being held centrally in the country that we could access, and it was being taken care of on a national basis, and that any change in prescribing practice would be communicated to us centrally.
Right. Thank you.
Got to be very cautious in making comments of this sort, but one is entitled to rely on central action on drug supply and a whole raft of other things that may come into short supply, recruitment not being the least of them. One's entitled to rely to some extent on central government action in relation to these things. But there must be a tendency on our part to go as far down the road as we can with putting our plans in order and our supplies secured without relying on central government as far as we're able to. I think we've probably learned that lesson. That's as far as I dare go with that. Shall we move on then, unless anybody else has got their hands up, and I don't think they have. Let me just say a couple of broad things and then have a go at dealing with the questions that have come in. Delighted that questions are coming in more volume as we go forward with this process. I mean, from a distance, the impact of one impact of COVID is that it's been a catalyst for change, quite a dramatic catalyst for change, and that's partly because challenges have appeared before us that we have to deal with, and partly because the constraints on change have somewhat fallen away too. So we've been able to make those changes without having to get through lots and lots of consent processes to do it. And that's given us a sort of sense of freedom, which may or may not be sustained. But I'd like to think it's sustained as part of our new normal. But I can see that the tide will turn on that to some extent as we move forward. There's always also been a change in the relationship between providers of healthcare and the communities that we serve. Not just not attending at A&E unless you really are in trouble, but in acceptance of remote consultation and so on. And also recognizing that care nearer home is happening now in a way that it was very slow to move initially. So we're not going to go back. We're with that. But the other legacy of COVID is fear, which is still everywhere, is mental health, which is built up substantially over this period. And it's the prospect of ongoing inequality in for years in a climate in which we won't use the word austerity or recession, but kind of they're out there somewhere. And overcoming that inequality is going to be the major battle for the years to come. But we are now looking at a future for healthcare, aren't we? That's much more coordinated, that's much more place-based, that's driven by data and by public health, that involves integration. And if you buy into that, as I think just about everybody does, that's going to demand a complete restructuring of the health service and the care service, because the structures we've got at the moment don't map onto that terribly well. So I can see over the next year the reluctance to deal in legislation to change structures being overcome, and actually those changes being made. So it's going to be very interesting over the next year to see how that plays out. Tosca, you've got a hand up.
Yes, thank you, David. It was just following up on your comment around the changes that have happened, and just to advise mainly the NEDs, because they won't be aware of this, that we've received recent guidance from NHSI that seems to suggest that we are to continue working in a virtual mode, certainly in respect of the board and the committees for the foreseeable future. So that's likely to continue, I think, until probably the new calendar year.
That's a long time, perhaps longer than we had in our minds. Let's see how that goes. There are advantages and there are disadvantages, and we somehow need to minimize the disadvantages of this situation, if that's what we're up against. Okay. Can I try and deal with the questions? We've had 3 questions in that I need to deal with, and they're all to do with vulnerable sections of society in one form or another. So there's a sort of theme to it. The answers to 1 or 2 of them are quite long, really, if I was to go into all aspects of it. And so what I will do is shortcut that a bit and just give the headlines. But I think, Joe, in a conversation with you afterwards, we'll try and get the fuller answer available on the website or wherever. So is that okay, Joe? Sorry, there was a brief hand.
Yes, just to confirm, David, the full written answers are ready to go, and as soon as you've finished your comments, they'll be available on the website.
That's a great comfort. Thank you very much. Right, the first question, and in a sense the most complex, is, well, literally it says, I'm not going to say where these questions came from because it's not that relevant really. They are important questions, so let's deal with them. What action have you taken to support BAME members of staff and service users during the COVID period? And what do you plan to do over the future period to continue that support? Okay, this is the one with the really long answer, and it's got a really long answer because there are so many facets to this that we are dealing with and have dealt with. And some of this was in process before, but the vulnerability, particularly of BAME staff and service users, during COVID has ensured that we take action to respond to that. First of all, every single member of BAME staff, sorry, my thing keeps leaking. Every single member of BAME staff have had a risk assessment, which deals with all aspects of what they do and where vulnerability may lie. And that's been reinforced by the offer of sort of health screening, a sort of MOT for all BAME staff. So the immediate vulnerability is recognised and has been dealt with in that comprehensive way. And exactly the same approach has been taken with BAME service users, so that there's been additional care taken, ensurance that they are not in a dormitory situation, for example. And so that's kind of the urgent and immediate central aspect. But there's counselling support, there are restroom facilities, there's the strengthening of infection control, a whole series of additional aspects to this. And of course, there's a wider context, isn't there? That this is a part of a cultural essential that at all parts of our trust, we instill a culture which is understanding and accepting, and that is the process that was underway beforehand and is continuing now at all levels, including at board level, where there are continuing programs to ensure that at board level there's a real understanding and ability to discuss fluently and accurately the issues that are involved. So it's a cultural thing, but there are a whole series of initiatives that we have taken and taken comprehensively. They're not just on offer, that they're sort of imposed in a sense, and that's crucial. And also, this has figured on the Service User Council and everything that goes on in that as well. So I don't want to say any more right now because I could go on for a long time covering all the aspects, but the full listing of the things that we're doing will be available on the website and so on. So can I move on to the second question? The second one, I'll read it out, it's kind of long, but the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly exposed fractures and challenges in care delivery nationally and locally, and of course internationally. A recent article in the HSJ highlighted that NHSE and NHSI have now ordered urgent reviews into the deaths of people with learning disabilities and autism. The CQC had published data in June 2020 which suggests death rates amongst those with LD and autism had doubled in the pandemic. NHSEI have previously refused to publish data on the LEDER programme, which I'll come on to in a minute. Would Combined Healthcare comment on the above, and is the Trust actively involved in providing data and information both on PHE and on NHSEI review on what certainly appears to be a significant flaw in the care delivery to an entirely vulnerable patient cohort? Long question, but a relevant one, and rather like BAME, absolutely in the forefront of people's minds at the moment. The answer to the question is yes. Let me deal with LEDER first, because this is a national operation set up 2 or 3 years ago to monitor, look into, examine, review deaths of people with learning disabilities and autism. It's a bit clunky. It's a bit slow because reviewers have to be appointed, and sometimes this takes time, when if there is an incident, you really want to get on with it and learn the lessons quickly. So what we have is an underlying operation which reviews mortality, any mortality across the trust. And within that, the LD and autism side is a subset, if you like, but we do a review in every relevant case, and we get on with that absolutely immediately. And if there is an LEDER review, we don't wait for that. We get on and we do it with the process that we've got, and we will then go back and go over it again once the LEDER process kicks in. So that's sort of what happens. And the mortality review is something which is on the agenda today and is regularly reviewed at all levels in the trust, including at board level. So that there is board oversight of that. And indeed, there's a report within the papers for today which shows just what the incidence is, which has been within our area very limited in relation to LD and autism deaths. So we are onto it. We are reviewing it. We're not caught up in delays, which a national system tends to involve, but we do participate fully in it. And that's sort of about it, really. I hope that there's a slightly fuller answer which will appear too, but I refer you to other bits of this agenda as well. So there's that. The third question, and I'll go through all the questions, and then if there are questions on the questions, then I'll deal with those as well. And this is from Andrew Budworth, who is the treasurer of Stoke-on-Trent Pride, and says, what events, activities, promotions did Combined Healthcare carry out for Stoke-on-Trent Pride this year? And what are you doing to ensure that the rights and profile of your LGBT staff and service users are protected and promoted all year round, not simply during the annual Pride season? Okay, this too is something which is in the forefront of our cultural minds as we operate as a trust, and has been for quite some time. And yes, there was a celebration of Pride Week in all sorts of ways that were evident at the time, and we had a flag wave of honour and those things. There were goodies distributed. There are all sorts of things, but in a sense, more importantly, it's an ongoing and continuous necessity seen by the board and every part of this trust. The LGBT, the community, are represented, protected and promoted all the year round. We have something called an Inclusion Council, which is a really serious bit of work in the sense that It's heavily represented. Peter chairs it, and Sajida is our executive lead for diversity and inclusion. And that ensures that concerns are dealt with, and more importantly, that LGBT community are fully supported in every aspect of the life of the trust. So there's all that. And again, there's a longer answer, which I will make sure is on the board. So has anybody got any comments they want to add to mine in relation to that? Sajida in particular, perhaps. And Jenny, absolutely. Do you want to start, Jenny, and then Sajida?
Okay, yeah, I was just going to add to that. I was just going to encourage board members and everybody else to engage. We're putting on some trans awareness training at the moment in the trust, and doing it with the other trust as well. I mean, you only have to look at the Stonewall survey recently that said 50% of trans people had said, no, 46% had said healthcare professionals lack an understanding of trans issues. So the real gap in education on that particular issue for LGBT people, and we are putting and we're trying to lead the way in that within our health economy, in putting on some training, and the appetite for it amongst clinicians is has surprised me. There's a real need for that. So I'd urge, if you can, and a couple of board members have attended that. So I'd urge you all to point people towards that, because that's particularly one area of LGBT life that is has not been well served by the NHS over the last few years, and you know, something obviously personally I'm passionate about, but I think there's a genuine need with our services to be better on that. So can I just and that's something we've put on. We've timed that for Pride Month, so that was part of what we discussed about launching that in Pride Month. So can I just encourage you to promote that if possible?
Can't let you go, Jenny, without saying how fabulous your podcast was. Thanks ever so much. Really brave, really helpful, brilliant. Anybody else on any of that?
Can I just say a few words, David? So I think I mean, you've mentioned the culture, etc. So I think society as a whole finds itself in quite a challenging time around some of the trans awareness issues and the BAME issues that we find ourselves faced with. So Jenny has just articulated some of the trans awareness sessions, which I would say is a must for everyone in terms of educating themselves. But in terms of what we're doing around some of those difficult issues that, you know, the NHS staff do face around some of that systemic racism, we will be looking at doing a leadership development piece across the system in terms of enabling people to have those difficult conversations and not just to tolerate and stand by while things occur. And I think, as we'll all see in Simon Stevens' letter, he did say that we're both the problem and the solution. So I think it's incumbent on NHS providers in particular to be leading the way around that. Now, we've got some funding to do that. So we are going to be looking at September in terms of some of that education learning piece. And that is something that we will equally be cascading throughout the organisation around some of our next steps, because what I would say is it's important that the NHS as an anchor institution does show that it is leading the way in terms of that cultural transformation piece.
Yeah, thanks. We mustn't forget that the NHS is the biggest employer in the country, and we've got to set a standard. Jenny, you still got your hand up.
So, sorry, I just want to come back quickly on that, because that was something we discussed at the Inclusion Council, and we had such a powerful presentation by a student nurse of their experience of racism in the workplace. Amazingly powerful. Interestingly, yesterday, with my other hat on with my other trust, I was talking about a very similar, almost identical type issue for a student nurse and abuse in the workplace. And actually, the issues were about how it was felt actually the staff had failed to support. I think colours have failed to, or not known how to support, maybe, if I'm giving it that. And it just showed to me, I think, I live in a bubble sometimes, and we're doing some amazing work on inclusion, on all these the issues for inclusion, and particularly from BAME. But actually, there still feels maybe a disconnect between the rank and file workforce and what we're talking about at a corporate level. And that I do think we need to be the NHS. I think. Forgive me, the NHS has been a bit complacent on these issues over the last, I think, decade, because the NHS has always been seen as more liberal and fluffy, where other members, I think, of public services like the police and like have actually grasped these things a bit more rigorously. We've got to be more brave. It's not enough for us to be anti-racist, to be non-racist. We've got to be anti-racist and actively so. And we've got to support people. We've got to empower staff better. And I think we are actually doing something really good. I was talking to the other trust about how we respond to cases of racism from service users, and the letters we write to service users make it very clear, and they've been impressed, I think, by what we're doing. And I think doing that as a system, because this isn't a problem just for Combined, this is a problem across our communities and the geography that we have. So I really welcome what you just said, that this is going to be looked at as a system, because this is not an issue that Combined can solve itself. But we've got to be careful we don't get in the bubble, I think, when we're in corporate area and we're doing some great work, and then when we hear what happens on the work, actually on the shop floor, so to speak, that's quite shocking. So I just wanted to echo what Shajid.
Thanks very much. Joan, you got your hand up.
Thank you. Just very quickly, thank you for all of that. I think it's really good that we're taking that lead. My question is, how much are we looking to, as well as doing things within our own organisation and within the NHS system, how much are we looking to face outwards? I was very conscious of an incident in Leek just yesterday, or it was reported in the press just yesterday. And I just wonder how much we see our responsibility as well, not just to be getting the right kinds of policies inside our own organisation at all levels with staff, but to be communicating that to the wider community across North Staffordshire as well as a mental health organisation.
So Joan, if I could respond to that. So we all know that there is a health inequalities issue for this country in terms of people accessing services. We equally know that there's a workforce inequalities issue in terms of the makeup of our workforce in representing the communities that we serve. And whilst we have things like RES, etc., we haven't, as an NHS, made the sufficient improvement that we probably need to. And I think that does probably go back to some of what Jenny says in terms of the fire service and the police being more aggressive in terms of positive action to try and address that gap that there is in the workforce. Now, what we have within the system, because this is very much a system issue, and Peter attends the Merit Group, which is a coalition of the West Midlands Mental Health Provider Trusts. So I'll be doing a presentation there as well, because as mental health providers, in terms of that wellbeing support aspect, we do have what I would call a significant responsibility to our population. So within our system, if I talk about our system for a moment, Joan, we have an equality, diversity, inclusion network that reaches out to the communities. And that has varying stakeholders, be it from education, be it from community groups, etc., on that group. If there's anybody that you feel that would be beneficial in terms of attending from a university background, we would welcome that. And the purpose of this group is to act as an expert reference group in terms of how we can ensure that the health inequalities in our population are being addressed. Now, in terms of what we're doing, we're looking at the workforce aspect. In terms of what this network will be looking at, it will be looking at the health inequalities aspect. So there's a huge amount of work that is ongoing in the background. And what I would say at this board is, I think there is a sense of we all have the data now. I think everybody's got data fatigue. We don't need any more data. I think there's an expectation that we now start to take action. One of the recommendations I made to the expert reference group is you need to include GPs, etc., in terms of looking at your pathways, in terms of how, you know, people from an LGBT or a BAME background are accessing services. Are they accessing services, and try and address it from that point? So it's not an understatement when I say there's a huge amount of work to be done by the NHS. One group cannot look at everything, which is why we've got workforce on one side and we've got the population health inequalities on the other side in terms of how that's being addressed. So I hope that gives you a flavour of what we're currently doing.
Sorry, okay, I was a bit slow to unmute there. Thank you very much. I think probably we've covered the subject there, haven't we, sufficiently? And so can we move on?